Hey there everybody, it's Wayne D. Welcome to the website, WayneD.com. We're looking at a young player. First time I've seen him, his name is Brett Walker. He played in a tournament with Dick Mast, and you know Dick. Worked with Dick for a while. Brett's 27, Dick is 67. Brett was pretty impressed with the way Dick played, because Dick's still a great player. And Dick suggested Brett was talking to him about trying to improve, and he wants to qualify for the Latin American tour. Brett is a working guy. He works in the summer at a club in Chicago, but he'd love to get a little better and start trying to play for a living. He's going to go down and play in Latin American qualifier in Brazil. So just watching the initial movement. First things that struck me was the weak grip, which I'm fine with. All you have to do is watch John Rahm, and you know that weak grips and laid off clubs are fine, as are hands that actually drop a little bit in the downswing. So in certain situations there's no problem with that. The other thing that was pretty obvious was the activity in the trigger, which if you watch Henrik Stenson, you'll also see that. Now in this case, Brett's issue is consistency. So from day to day, while he could shoot low scores, his ability to shoot them all the time, he just has days where he doesn't hit the ball as good. So I have two goals here. One, after watching this, so let's slow this down, and I'll show you what I pick out to work on. A couple things that I think would really help. One would be simply to get the club going back without quite as much movement. So I like triggers, but when they get a little bit overactive, unless the player has worked that in and is already making money, making a living, I'd say let's just quiet down a little bit. You can probably get the club back with a simpler trigger. So as we watch, we'll see the right knee bend toward the ball, counter rotate the hips. There's a sitting action, pull away. So from the front, you can see the sideways motion a lot right here. Big slide of the hips. And then, as good players will do, a quick recovery. But now the sequencing is a little bit goofed up, because the upper body is moving over this way, and the lower body is just trying to come back into the box. But the sense of it is that the upper body is kind of leaning down and over the lower, and then the lower will rotate and the upper will cover, and what we end up with is a limited amount of lateral, and the head starting to get a little bit in front of the ball. So these things can be a little disconcerting when you get a short iron in your hand. Some of these divots could get a little bit on the steep side. Now, like I said, Brett's a good player. He can play in some tournaments and do fine. But we're going to try to just do a couple things to make this a little more consistent. Gotta like the way he planes the club. Very good at that. His hips have plenty of depth, although when you take a look at this, the pelvis is very, very level here. Gets the club right out on his hands very nicely. Goes around on the plane. You can see his head is backed up a bit. Now about that hand drop here, the problem that I usually have with that is that the right arm tends to go down behind the body, but in this case Brett really gets his right arm into nice shape in front of him. So again, you might ask, what are you going to do? Why don't just leave this alone? Well, when I watch this position through the ball, I just get the feeling that he's not able to use the ground very well, and he's just not going to get consistent compression on the ball with his hips that far back and his head forward. All right. So the first thing we want to do is see what happens in a stop and go situation with a quieter trigger. So we'll just do a little forward press of the hands, and we'll reduce the amount of everything else. So what you're going to see is the hips stay in the box, head's going to move slightly right, and that's going to look a little wider and a lot more conventional. Here it is from the back. So that's extremely different right there. So you don't see all that lower body movement. Club comes up the plane, so it's still going to look nice. So as we watch this one, we were talking about after this how we could deepen that right hip a little bit. So these are stop and goes, and now in the stop and go we really haven't talked about lower body movement yet, so you still see mostly spinning, very little lateral movement. So now we're going to wind one up with a little more right hip depth. So you can see at the end of that he's making an effort to get back into the right side of that pelvis and stretch those muscles a little more. Now the goal there would be to be able to brace in against that leg and use that to propel the pelvis forward enough so that the head might stay still, but here you can see that's not happening. So we spent a couple of minutes talking about lateral movement. So let's go back to here's the stop and go again with that hip depth. Now you got to admit, that looks pretty classic right there. So that just looks like a more powerful use of the pivot on the right here. It's ready to go. And then the last thing, we spent a lot of time discussing what is going to get the pelvis to start forward. So when we wind that thing up in the stop and go and deepen that right hip, it's going to feel nice and braced on the inside of that right leg. So if we go back to the first one and compare, let's watch. Alright, so the discussion here was once these guys are loaded and the leg is braced, when the hips begin to change direction, moving this way, we're going to use the brace and we're going to let the ground drive the pelvis forward with the goal of keeping the head where it is. So let's watch. So this is what I would call an average amount of forward movement amongst good players. Now again, if we draw the line up from the ball, he is still just swiveled a little in front of it, but once the brain understands that there is a mechanism to get the pressure shifted to the left without leaning the upper body over, then we can create that drag on the club. And we'll get the hands a little more forward and hit from a little more behind it. So those are the big things that we tried to accomplish. Again, lessen the trigger, wind up behind the ball with some right hip depth, and then use the ground to help achieve more pressure shift early in the downswing so that eventually we can keep the head from getting ahead of the ball. And now you'll see the difference in where those hips are through impact. Big difference. All right.